We've got a handful of graduates on the sides. I know y'all are counting down the minutes at this point until you have made it out of the gauntlet that is high school. So congratulations on that front, and we'll have celebrations to come. Mark, yes sir.
You covered this last week, but she wasn't here. I think we got a graduate in our presence.
Yep. A new master's degree. We are stacking up the big time degrees in the gang. But with that said, next Sunday evening we're going to have a party here at the church. Kind of that block party we talked about. Pinewood Derby, games, food. So I have sign-up sheets there in the back if you want to help out with that. I know Dairy's probably cooked out after all the hamburgers from field day the other day. So, but we're gonna do it again. Well, we do have the easy hot dog turner. So next Sunday at 5, we're gonna have a spring into summer block party here and just have some fun. And then I guess the other two things on the docket will be VBS in June, which I know it's the third week, but did we say Sunday through Thursday or Monday through Friday? What was the...
Monday through Friday.
Monday through Friday.
After Father's Day.
Tracking. Good thinking. Yes. I thought that, but then I didn't want to
6:30, 8:30.
6:30 day. Got it. Okay. Monday through Friday, 6:30, 8:30. I'll get those flyers and everything posted, and in the almighty Grand Wizard of Smithville, what is it? WJLE. Like if it goes in there, everybody knows about it, right? So, and then the last, I guess, item on the to-do list is we technically are scheduled for a business meeting tonight. Now, I don't know, does Mother's Day, that we want to punt on that and move it? What are we thinking? What? I hear a yes. I hear yeses to that. Okay. There's not a whole lot in the docket, and if anything, we could tackle that next Wednesday. It's basically talking about what we're going to do this summer with the youth and then how it's going to affect the Wednesday night programming. But that'll be just fine on that side. I think announcement-wise, that's about it. Am I correct? Does that sound...
We added one. The 26th, the last Sunday night at 5, we're going to have a graduation celebration for the graduates.
I know I had that in a text message somewhere.
Yes.
You're going to do two?
Yeah. Okay.
So we got graduation parties and summer parties and VBS and just, I guess just time to party in that sense is what it sounds like, right? So this morning, let's step into a time of prayer and concerns and what are actually rejoices for answers to prayers this week as Sean is back home. Am I correct? So I'll probably speak, well, there's probably no way to properly articulate it. It's probably been a long 7 days since we were initially breaking news here last Sunday, but 7 short days later, but probably didn't feel like short days to family on the front line. Yeah, we're out of the ICU, out of the hospital, and back home. I told Sean it's never just the flu, right? You can't just get an easy one. But definitely thanks for prayers on that, and just concern and everything on that front. So that's definitely an answer to prayer there. What else are we thinking or thankful about for this morning?
Nursing homes, patients and caregivers, and then also all those for cancer. It seems like there's a lot of cancer popping up again.
It does. I went and played bingo on Wednesday over at the nursing home. You know, that was an adventure.
Oh.
So.
I bet that was.
What? It's kind of a nobody loses outlook on bingo. They just keep playing. They let 5 or 6 people call bingo, and then they'll start a new board and go again. So Yeah, it wasn't real uber competitive. There was a table that's always accused of cheating, apparently. When one of the guys would call out, he'd go, "Cheating table has a bingo." So I guess it's common knowledge that the back middle table is a bunch of cheaters. They do give out little championship bracelets, essentially, when you call bingo. There's these little beaded bracelets. But what you want to do, the key to this really, is to not win the early rounds and get a bracelet and win the later rounds and get pudding. That's what I found out is the key. Don't come out the gate too fast. You want to be on the pudding and jello side of life. On winning bingo. So that was fun. Anything else this morning?
Mr. Barrett and Kim Fowler.
And I think coming off the heels of Teacher Appreciation Week, we're praying for our teachers as y'all come down to home stretches as well. It's not the short 5 to 7 days. You know, you've probably got a week or a few weeks afterwards wrapping up. But the end is in sight for y'all as well. Right? So let's go ahead and bow our heads this morning. Dear Lord, we come to you today in such a different frame of mind and such a different space this morning. We thank you for putting the family and bringing the family back together to lift up your name. We thank you for your presence. We thank you for the comfort. We thank you most importantly for an answer to prayers this week as we saw Sean get healthier and healthier every day. We thank you for being there with family members and hopefully providing still waters in the midst of what at times felt like a storm. We thank you for bringing many people in this community together and calling and activating the prayer warriors in our midst, lifting up families and Sean with care. We just thank you for your presence and everything you've done and continue to do in the midst of his life and our family's life as well. We also come this morning, we pray for those who are in various forms of long-term care in nursing homes and rehabilitation units and the caregivers that surround them when family members can't be with them every day. We pray for the many illnesses that maybe we don't remember or can't think of right now, but we know are in our midst, and we pray for the sick and the hungry, the lonely in and around us. Allow us and help us to be instruments of thy peace and to be your hands and feet in those prayer concerns this morning. Let us lift up these concerns with words, but also as we go forth from here, let us put flesh on these words and care for these concerns as well. Show us the best way to praise your name is to pick up our cross and follow you as we walk out into this world. We pray all these things in your Son's heavenly resurrected name that gives us the hope to keep moving forward. Amen.
This time we'll take up offering. Ushers moving forward.
Lord, we just thank you for this day and thank you for all your many blessings. Lord, we just pray for the ones who couldn't make it this morning and hope they're safe. And, the ones that are traveling, and pray for safe travels for those, and just pray for anyone that is lost and has a family. Pray for love and all this for your church. This one I pray. Amen.
They're going to be singing Awesome God. Yep.
Hi, buddy.
Hey, no, look how are you doing?
rolls up his sleeves, he ain't just putting on the wrist.
Our God is an awesome God.
There's thunder in his footsteps and lightning in his fist.
Our God is an awesome God.
And the Lord wasn't joking when he kicked them out of Eden. It wasn't for no reason that he shed his blood. His return is very close, and you better be believing that our God is an awesome God. Our God is an awesome God. He reigns from heaven above with wisdom, power, and love. Our God is an awesome God. Our God is an awesome God. He reigns from heaven above with wisdom, power, and love. Our God is an awesome God. When the sky was starless in the void of the night,
Our God is an awesome God.
well, he spoke into the darkness and created the light.
Our God is an awesome God.
Judgment and wrath he poured out of Sodom. Mercy and grace he gave us at the cross. I hope that you have not too quickly forgotten that our God is an awesome God. Our God is an awesome God. He reigns from heaven above with wisdom, power, and love. Our God is an awesome God. Our God is an awesome God. He reigns from heaven above with wisdom, power, and love. Our God is an awesome God. Our God is an awesome God. He reigns from heaven above with wisdom, power, and love. Our God is an awesome God. Our God is an awesome God. He reigns from heaven above with wisdom, power, and love. Our God is an awesome God. Our God is an awesome God. He reigns from heaven above with wisdom, power, and love. Our God is an awesome God. Our God is an awesome God. Our God is an awesome God.
You did that wonderfully.
Let's do noisy change. Lord, thank you for everything you do for us, and thank you for being an awesome God and everything you do. And Lord, just thank you for all the children that's up here, and thank you for everybody that came this morning, and bless this noisy change, Lord. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
There you go. Okay, look here. Would rather be up, it doesn't matter. James is trying to get you started. Look here. All right, come this way, boss. Slower. Now follow them boys through and go pull it in.
Well, today, like many, oh good, I'm live. We are hot. There you go. Today, like many Sundays, completely unintentionally, Susan reads my mind and does something that transitions perfectly into what we're talking about. There was a time when to hear Michael W. Smith's Awesome God meant you were in a very cutting-edge church. That was the most contemporary of the contemporary. That was the song that was only sung in youth group, right? Those words like awesome to describe God went over about as well as a ton of bricks with the old established powers that be in churches, and here we are. It's a part of our normal traditional Sunday worship service. We have seen what was once new and cutting edge and groundbreaking and almost scandalous and in some ways become part of our daily routines and rhythm. And in many ways that fits so perfectly well into what we're talking about in this series, in the discussion that Jesus had in Luke about new wine and old wineskins, or old wine and new wineskins, and the wrestling and the back and forth that is and will always be this relationship. And so as you have with a lot of any type of sermon series, there's this awkward first few minutes of the sermon where you have to summarize what you did previously before moving forward. So I'll try to make this as quick, synoptic, and not as boring and painful. Caleb would get really good at this when he would go to bigger churches, that he knew the first 20 minutes of this hour-long sermon, it's not going to be that long, was just going to be summary from the week before. So Caleb knew, okay, if church starts at 10, I'll show up about 10:35 after we've sung the songs and gotten through the intro portion of the sermon. But we're in this passage in the book of Luke, and we'll talk about the flow of the stories and the placement of the stories today a little bit. But we're in this passage in the book of Luke where Jesus uses one of his first metaphors to talk about life. And he talks about life as wine. And I think that's such a fitting metaphor as we talked about last week, because one of the things about wine is it is further and continually fermenting and expanding and developing. And that is so true about our lives. Our lives are not stagnant. Your life is continually fermenting and expanding. It is not a stagnant, still thing. Life is in motion. Life is developing. Life is like wine in these growing stages. And because life is expanding and moving in all its many ways, the containers of our lives have to be able to expand. There has to be some give and some stretch in the containers of our lives to contain this thing we call life. But at times, these containers reach their maximum capacity to stretch, and then we need to find new containers, because if we continue to live an expanding, fermenting life in stretched to the limit containers, we risk ripping, tearing, and ruining the old containers of our lives. See, I think God is always in the business of giving us new life, and in that sense, we are always in the discussion and the flow of finding proper containers and wineskins to hold and contain this ever-expanding life. So we began this discussion about the old wineskins and the challenges of the old wineskins and the challenges of moving on from the old and trying new things and needing to go into new. And it can be all too easy that you can think I'm using references of the old as a punching bag. And I'm not saying that, and I almost want to reframe that a little bit to say the old containers and wineskins of our life are cherished and they're loved, and in many ways we're very sentimental about the old containers in our life because they're where we lived. They're what held life in various stages. And there's nothing wrong with the old containers and the old wineskins, but to a degree, they served their purpose in their appointed or desired time. That there's a timeliness aspect of these wineskins. And so the conversation here this morning is that God is always giving new life. That God is always pouring new wine and new life and new expansions and new fermentings of God's Spirit into the world. And because we know that is an ever-flowing constant, we could have another discussion about the metaphors of God, the statements that Jesus defines God as, the I am statements in the book of John. That could be another discussion for another day, but we know that this living water, this river of life, it's a river, it's not a pond. It's always moving. It's being fed from a spring somewhere, and that water is on the move. So we know the water of life being poured into our lives is moving and has this source that keeps feeding it. It's not limited. It's not a certain amount. It's not a pond. We don't know the subtotal of God's movement, of what God's going to pour into our life. And because God is always pouring in new and good into the life, the challenge we have with containing is a horrible word to use here because we all know we can't contain God or wrap God up, but is trying to find the containers and the institutions and the habits and the disciplines and the rhythms of life that can hold and deliver and help us take and drink from this new wine. And here's a powerful thing, is if we think about this movement of God, of a pouring out of new wine, what's interesting here is we think about this life and the ministry and the story of Jesus. And Jesus actually does not come in off the jump from the beginning with an outpouring of the Spirit. The beginning of the ministry of Jesus is not new life and resurrection and an outpouring of the Spirit. That's further down the road. That's at the end of the Gospels. The outpouring of this new Spirit, that's in Acts 2. So what does Jesus do for the first 2 years and 10 months of the ministry? He wrestles with those old wineskins. He stretches that capacity a little further. He probes and pushes people to think about the new containers they need for the newness of God. If you look at the story in the gospel of Jesus Christ and in the 4 iterations we have of telling this story, the overwhelming majority of those parables and those teachings and those healings and those moments is not the outpouring of new wine. It's the trying to make room for new wineskins. And this is not an easy process. There is something painful and dislocative about making room and carving out space and getting rid of some of the old. I jokingly thought about last night as I was in here cleaning the church that to maybe reinforce this metaphor, I should just move everything around in the church to show you how fun it is when you move stuff around and how painful that could be. But hey, I didn't feel like moving a lot of pews by myself. I jokingly said I should just get rid of the back like 5 pews and force everybody to sit up here and act like we're making room for something big and exciting in the back, but that was a lie, and I couldn't do that. But that would have been an illustration of, think about how joyful you would have been this morning if you came in and your pew was not where it was supposed to be and you had to sit in a new pew, right? That'd go over real well. When I was working at the YMCA, one time we brought in new treadmills. And we set the treadmills in the exact same place the old treadmills had been. The same spacing, the same line. But people felt like these new treadmills were in a new place. And so for the first 3 weeks of them being there, every day were complaints about the location of the treadmills. They feel too close to the TVs. They feel too close together. You just listen to the complaint, you nod your head, I'll take a look. And one of the CEOs, he said, what we should do? We should just come in one day and we should change all the treadmills and have them face each other awkwardly. So as you would do your running, there'd be somebody kind of there in front of you running at you. And he said that people would really not like that. So when you moved them back to the way they are now, they'd be so happy that they're not in the way that they were. He said that's the key to doing this. Do something that's way worse first. So that when you go back, it's like, oh, that's better than it was. But we know how well the newness and sometimes this painfulness of making room and cleaning out. Maybe that's why some of you all, you almost need somebody else to come in and do the spring cleaning for you, because there's items that you just can't seem to throw away. Right? That's my mom to a degree. There's this aspect. Mom has this couch where she keeps all the newspapers that she hasn't read yet. And I guess here in 2 weeks, when she's done teaching, she's going to have enough time to read all the newspaper articles she doesn't get to read, having to run out the door in the morning to school. But this couch just becomes a receptacle for all the newspapers. Well, every once in a while, Dad gets in a cleaning mode and takes all those newspapers and decides, we don't need this newspaper from January anymore here in the beginning of May, and puts it in the recycling bin and takes it to the dump. And every time Dad does this, that's when Mom sits down to read the newspapers, and there's an argument about, what'd you do with my newspapers? I hadn't gotten to those yet. It's hard sometimes to do our own spring cleaning because there's things we can't say goodbye to just yet. You have that set of clothes somewhere in your closet or your room that you can't fit into anymore, or you're not going to wear, but you want to. You can't let. I got a pair of those jeans. They're the first jeans I decided to wear that fit. When they weren't crazy baggy. They're my first non-baggy pair of jeans. And I'm not going to wear them anymore. They're worn out. But I can't throw them away for some awkward, stupid, sentimental reason. They have a spot reserved for them at the bottom of the drawer where they're never going to move. Because cleaning out and making space and saying goodbye to the old to make room for the new is not an easy process. It can be a painful process. And that's really the story of the early part of Jesus' ministry. Is not an outpouring of the Spirit, like I said, that comes in Acts 2. But it's actually this conversation and this back and forth about trying to carve out and make room for new wineskins amongst all these stored up, old, stretched out containers at times. And that's why it's interesting as we look in this passage of Luke, this parable of new wine and old wineskins happens here in the middle of chapter 5, but actually, more importantly, it happens in a stream of stories. This is where the gospel writers were geniuses. They didn't just tell each story in isolation. The one story typically is related to what comes before it and what comes after it. And these stories and how they are told and the order and how they are told is intentional. There's a fancy word for this in the midst of biblical studies, and this is called intercalation. And so this parable is placed in the middle of a handful of actions of Jesus, where he is finding himself at odds with the religious powers that be. And like I said last week, is if you think about this, think the only people that had issues with the gospel of Jesus Christ were those that had control of the religious structures of the day. The normal people didn't have a problem with it. The day-to-day folks and the people that struggled with what Jesus was saying the most and argued with what Jesus was saying the most were religious powers that be. And there's something in that. We'll touch on that in a second, but it's in the midst of a handful of stories where Jesus' view and ministry is coming into contention and rub with the way things were done, with the law and the rules of the day. And so this starts off with the story of Jesus cleaning and healing a leper. And I could lean into all the nuances and the rules of the day, but that leper was considered sick. And that sickness was believed to be, that individual was at odds with God. And this sickness was believed to be motivated by an unjust relationship with God, and it was also believed to be highly contagious. So lepers were kept in complete isolation on the outside of town. And if you got close to the camp of lepers, they had bells and were to warn you not to get any closer. In the beginning of the ministry of Jesus, Jesus finds himself not only coming close to a camp of lepers, but in close personal relationship with the leper. And this leper sits there and asks Jesus to heal him. And Jesus heals him, but as if that wasn't scandalous enough, Jesus heals him by laying hands on him. You weren't allowed to get close to these people. And Jesus puts hands and touches this sickness, touches this untouchable illness, puts hands on this leper's face, and as that leper leans in to this touch, who hasn't had human touch, who hasn't been hugged in God knows how long. It wasn't just the healing that followed, it was all the rules that Jesus was breaking to even get to the healing. And then right after this, you lean into this story of it's the Sabbath day, and there are rules around the Sabbath day. And there are boundaries around things. But right before we get to the Sabbath day, there's a story of Jesus' teaching in a house, and the house is so crowded you can't get to Jesus. And a handful of friends carry their paralyzed friend, and we talked about the story just a handful of weeks ago, but they lower him in to the roof. And once again, it's actually, the story's not about the healing. The healing isn't the scandalous part. The scandalous part about this is Jesus says, your sins are forgiven. And the powers that be look at him and begin to think, who is he? Who does he think he is to say things like that? Jesus says, what's more troubling here for you? The fact that I said the sins are forgiven, or the fact that I'm going to tell him to get up off his mat and walk? Which is harder, bud? He gets off the mat and walks out and proves that Jesus is who Jesus says he is. Proves that Jesus can say things like that because they happen. And then Jesus goes out, finds this man by the name of Levi, who was a tax collector, who was a sellout in many ways. The only thing worse than a Roman tax collector was a Jewish tax collector. Somebody who had sold out from the people and now were benefiting on the taxations of the empire. And so Levi, Matthew, is the worst of the worst. Jesus leans into this person and says, come be a disciple of me and follow me. So Matthew invites him over to his house and has dinner for him with all of his other sellout tax collector friends and all their questionable friend selections. And once again, the powers that be look at Jesus and say, that's a pastor? Hanging out with people like that? You're not allowed to do that. That's unclean. That's a bad reputation. What are you doing? Surrounding yourself with people like that. And then the question comes where we get the parable of the new wine. People sit there and say, you know, Jesus, a very Barney Fife type moment. You know, Jesus, everybody else fasts on the Sabbath, but your disciples, your friends, they eat on the Sabbath. Jesus begins to talk about new wine and old wineskins. And right after this poignant parable about the expanding life and the containers that can't contain it anymore, we come to the Sabbath day. We come to that day that we were told to keep holy after the Exodus. And Jesus is walking along with his disciples. You could tell they're hungry. And I don't know if he gave them a nod or if he told them it was okay. And so as they're walking through the fields, they begin to pluck grains in the wheat fields and rub them between their fingers and eat the grain. Now, I don't know about you, that would not fill me up. I would have to eat probably a lot of kernels of grain to get anywhere. So, hey, part of me hears this and is like, that had been about as effective as eating a whole bag of sunflower seeds when you were hungry. It wasn't going to do anything. But the thought police, the religious police, find them doing this as if they had nothing else better to do than follow Jesus and his friends around and find out what they were doing wrong. Does anybody have those religious people in their life that it seems like their entire religious construct is built on catching other people in their fallenness? As if you don't have enough to do taking care of yourself. You're so bored taking care of yourself that you're going to fill up your time by catching other people in their sin, right? You know any of those people? You don't have to point them out. You can keep that to yourself. It's okay. Or maybe there's part of you that's done that, right? There's part of you that you find that when somebody else makes a mistake, and so you've got this running tab in your head, and you know in this ultimate pros and cons list that you're allowed a cheat day somewhere here in your religious construct because you caught somebody else breaking some rules. So Jesus sits there and responds to this religious police of the day and basically says, "You're right. I know the rules are this, and the rules have always been this. You're completely correct." But do you remember what David did when his friends were hungry? He would go into the temple and then eat the bread from the holiest place in the temple to give to his friends. David broke the rules too. And maybe it's not so much about the breaking the rules. Maybe we need to have a conversation about what the rules were and mean and should mean or were meant to mean. And maybe we misinterpreted or wrestled with them incorrectly. The conversation about new wine and old wineskins is not just a 1-3-verse parable. It's in the midst of a lot of actions and movements and arguments where Jesus is actually pouring new wine into the life of these people, and some can contain it because their wife they're already there at that new wineskin. But the folks that can't contain the new life of God, it's not just this parable. It's all these stories are about this making room for the new wine of God. What is more important? To do good on the Sabbath or to keep it holy? What's more important? To follow the rules or care for human need? What's more important? To check your church attendance box or to be out there caring for people and putting hands on those who haven't had hands put on them? And this is the rub of new wine into old wineskins. So I'll close today by finally, we've talked about this metaphor and we've played with it, and I think you now understand the limitations of old wineskins and that we need to move into new wineskins. But we haven't actually named any old wineskins that we need to throw out. We haven't actually piled up any of the old ways of doing things that need to be put in the recycling bin. So right now it's all ethereal, fun thoughts. So I'll talk to you this morning really quickly about an old wineskin and a new wineskin. You have heard it said, and think about it, this is probably a phrase you've heard many times in your religious life, that to invite Jesus into your life. When somebody comes to the altar, they are accepting Jesus into their life. They are answering the door. Think of that picture. You know the picture I'm talking about, where Jesus is outside of a door about to knock on it, or he's in the middle of knocking on it. And our religious life, our religious challenge is to answer that bloody door and to invite Jesus in and to have a meal with Jesus. And for many of you, that is a powerful wineskin that has worked. You know that image. You know that door. Hopefully you've invited that guest in. Like Jesus would say in the Sermon on the Mount and the sermon that follows in Luke 6. In Luke 6, Jesus begins this sermon where 6 times Jesus says, "You have heard it said, but I say to you." You have heard it said to invite Jesus into your life. And I say to you this morning, that's not what Jesus said at all. Jesus didn't want to be invited into your life. Jesus wanted to invite you into his. Jesus didn't ask his disciples if he could follow them. Jesus asked his disciples if they would follow him. See, in a way, if we make it about inviting Jesus in, we can selectively choose where we let Jesus into the rooms of our life. But if we discover that it's supposed to be us being invited into Jesus' life, to follow Jesus' example, to take part in Jesus' life. That means we have to leave the house. We have to move away from what we're comfortable in. And this is the struggle of Peter, right? This is the issue. On that night before the crucifixion, and Jesus gets out, and they have this meal, and he gets up, and he gets the wash basin out, and he ties the rope around his waist, and he begins to wash feet. See, this is why Peter, while seeming magnanimous, said, no, 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 don't wash my feet. You're not worthy enough to do that. Because Peter, somewhere deep in his being, knew that his call was not to invite Jesus into his life, but the call was to be invited into Jesus' life. And if Jesus washed his feet, then that meant Peter had to do the same. The call this morning is to think about letting go of the old wineskin, of the old verbiage, of being the inviter of Jesus, and to think about and to practice and to get out this new wineskin and this new thought that you are actually the invited of Jesus. It's not about being called or you calling Jesus into your life. It's about you being called into Jesus' life. Just think about that for a second. Think about what that means and what that entails as we just finished the Easter story. That's a bigger question that I want you to think about all week. But in that space and that hard question, there's room for stretching. There's room for expanding. There's space to grow. When you follow Jesus, you might find you end up in a new container. And that new container can contain the new outpouring of God's life, of God's wine into your life. That also means you have to let go of some old metaphors, of some old pictures, some old phrases of God. That can be hard. That can be sentimental. But those have served their time and their place, and you can love them and still move forward. So the call this morning as we work our way towards Pentecost, and the next as we work our way towards the outpouring of God's Spirit, is to prepare the wineskins of our life. Amen.